Hey everybody. A couple quick notes before starting today's episode. First off, special thanks to KiwiBella101 for the awesome review they posted. KiwiBella says, I have been in the dark about the world of drugs for my whole life. A few months ago, I tried cannabis for the first time. Ever since then, I've had a growing interest in learning about all the other popular substances and the way they affect the body. I just started listening to this podcast today, but I already love it. So many different stories and perspectives on different substances that I believe people need to be educated about. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much, KiwiBella. The second and final thing on the list is this episode is going to be a little bit different than previous episodes, in that this isn't derived from a conversation had by me and the subject. This is actually a piece that was written and read by today's subject. So, it is a little bit different, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you do too. Having said all that, thanks for listening.
It all really started in a group chat, and our group chat prior to the event had only discussed the topic of party favors and euphemism, but never made any mention of any commitment to bring or supply. So I was just walking into the whole affair, cautiously optimistic that somehow drugs would just be there. Of course, Nevada had legalized recreational marijuana a couple of years prior, which meant at a minimum, I'd be getting stoned. As the last arrival at Airbnb, the moment I entered, I was greeted with beer, liquor, and of course weed. Clearly, we were off to a good start. From there, it would only be about 5 more hours before we'd be balls deep in the world's largest EDM festival. As we were preparing to leave the house, it was brought to my attention that a member of our party had brought several hits of LSD, which I promptly purchased from him, 4 hits in total. Since I've never been known for moderation, and I've never tried acid, my initial intent was to drop 2 to 3 hits the first night, and whatever remained on subsequent nights. Go big or go home, as they say. My friends would go on to strongly advise me against such a large dose, at which point I acquiesced and dropped a single hit. On our way out the door to the venue, my brother passed me a gummy edible from the dispensary for the bus ride. And by the time we arrived at the festival, sufficient time should have passed for the LSD to have taken hold, but alas, it had not. The gummy edible produced its familiar effect, however mild it may have been on its own. Resigned to the fact that the LSD had let me down, I found the remainder of my night and THC high and countless shots of Fireball and Irish whiskey that had been smuggled to security. This was fuel enough to keep the party going until the shuttle buses began ferrying partygoers back to their domiciles, to nap briefly before repeating the entire affair.
Uses mirrors and lenses to amplify and focus the energy of the sun.
Upon returning to our Airbnb around 5 a.m., my brother informed us that he had some MDMA to share. At this point, I lit up like a child on Christmas morning. From the ashes of my failed LSD experiment rose a beautiful pharmaceutical-grade phoenix, and its name was Molly. We all dosed simultaneously and turned up the bass as we waited for the effects to creep in. My middle brother and I took a sideline and watched as member after member began their roles. After 45 minutes of waiting for the E to kick in, I'd almost given up on the ecstasy as another shitty batch, akin to the LSD. But then I remembered that I'd binge-eaten a shit ton of food shortly after arriving home, unlike the remainder of our party, who had taken theirs on empty stomachs. In the interim, I envied the concurrent highs of those around me. But, while it may have taken longer than anticipated, once the shifting frames of reality entered my conscious mind, envy, frustration, longing, all melted away into, well, ecstasy. Any hint of exhaustion was lost in my new euphoric state. After exchanging full-body massages with anyone within arm's length, I spent much of the remainder of my role exploring textures and intimacy and passion. I found myself completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of my experience and hoped I'd remain in this blissful state indefinitely. Just after noon, though, bodies littered the Airbnb in lifeless heaps. In a few short hours, we'd be awake, preparing to do it all again. But this time, as we were preparing to leave the house for the second night, I'd resolved to make the most of it. I dropped 2 of the remaining 3 hits of LSD before anybody noticed what I'd done. If a little should have been good, perhaps a lot would be great. A member of our party who had provided the bum LSD offered me half a bag of mushrooms as a gesture of goodwill for the failed hit. Together with this, my brother also provided me 1 more hit of MDMA, as well as all other members of our party, with instructions to wait until late into the night to take it, maximizing its effects during the big headliner shows. While waiting and hoping for the LSD to take my soul on an adventure, we entered the festival for the second night, and I immediately ingested the mushrooms. At this point, I was no longer interested in understanding my tolerance, so I made sure to eat every fucking last piece in that bag. Of course, it was all washed down with even more shots of Fireball and more Irish whiskey. Sufficient time had passed, and the last 2 hits of LSD proved to be as useless as the first. Just as all hope for a psychedelic trip seemed to be slipping through my fingers, time and space began crushing down on me as we were squeezed through the bottleneck of a densely packed crowd. In that moment, I was keenly aware that the mushrooms were infecting my mind, altering reality around me. I quickly took the hand of my rave bay so I wouldn't be swept away with the crowd or simply float off the face of the earth. Of such were the existential crises I was now facing. As we slithered our way through the throngs of partygoers, the faces and bodies around me took on a stop-frame motion sense of action. As I drifted into and out of self-awareness, I distinctly found myself mesmerized by the ebb and flow of the speed of life as it shifted around me. If I turned away from a scene for even the briefest moment, it was replaced by something 100% different than my mind had left it. I recognized exactly nothing from moment to moment. And in another instant, I fully comprehended the gravity of my situation. If I were momentarily swept away with the crowd or looked over my shoulder too long, I'd ask my bay and my group with no recourse of contacting them until I was lucid again. I squeezed my bay's hand with an increasing intensity at this thought. Sometime shortly thereafter, or perhaps it was before, my brother gave us the signal and we all dropped our MDMA. This night was going from good to great, or perhaps it already had. At this point, my mind begins to fragment and my night becomes a series of timeless, disjointed scenes, not unlike strips of film fallen on the cutting room floor. A prevailing memory imprinted on my brain was listening to Paul Oakenfold's set, hand in hand with my brother, and being completely overwhelmed, both physically and psychologically, by the sight and sounds at his venue. This avalanche of stimulants utterly leveled me, and I was barely able to roll my head in my eldest brother's direction and simply mouth my amazement at how unreal this experience was. He said nothing, but I read his expression with crystal clarity, and in an instant, my connection with him was changed forever. At some point in time, my middle brother materialized out of the aether and led me away from my safe space in the hands of my bay and eldest brother. He spoke of adventure and musical curiosities as he led me along, a Pied Piper of sorts, dancing in his beautiful blue robes. As he led me on, I only remember him drifting further and further from me, as though we were on an unseen riptide, until his face melted into the crowd ahead of me and I was alone in a sea of thousands of nameless faces. I have no idea how it happened, but in spite of myself, I still managed to find myself at the singular venue I had explicitly planned that evening, Res. Rez's show was another life-changing experience. With a seemingly perfect cocktail of chemicals coursing through my brain, the brooding bass lines of her set crashed over me like tidal waves. Overcoming the crescendos was a surreal psychological and emotional experience akin to writing a bull. Unfortunately, the time dilation effect of the mushrooms made the hour-long transcendence feel like the blink of an eye. And then it was over. The crowds began to fade, and I was lucid for a brief moment and realized I was lost and completely out of my goddamn mind. The next series of events was equally disjointed as I wrestled with my intellect to find my group beyond all odds. At some point, I realized there might be a chance they'd been waiting for me at a familiar rally point, in spite of my being off hour. My gambit paid off as we were reunited in rounds of hugs and laughter. This probably ended our second night. I can't really be sure. My next memory is waking up on day 3. And day 3 began with the knowledge that we were completely out of E. Each member of the group knew that if we wanted to party, we were down to booze and weed. So, in rounds, we stocked up on plenty of each. After returning from the local dispensary, my eldest brother asked me if I was ready to, quote-unquote, go beyond Thunderdome. It's an expression we'd reserved for excessive consumption. I was under the mistaken impression that I had already done so the night before, but I couldn't have possibly been more wrong. Naively, I said yes. Then he produced an entire chocolate bar from the dispensary and told me, when the time comes, to eat the whole fucking thing. In my ignorance, I took the bar with that exact intent. I may have been talked out of 1 or 2 squares by the other members of our squad, but the remainder of the bar was consumed just ahead of the security checkpoint. And in that moment, my fate was sealed. By the time we arrived at the gates, I was already on Fury Road, well on the path to Thunderdome. I noticed early on that a steep dose of THC had an effect similar to the prior night's mushrooms, but it was a sloppy imitation. Stop frame had given away to slow motion, as though I were aware of the Earth's rotation on its axis. This couldn't be good. Further into the base pod, I recall headbanging to some nameless DJ I can't remember. At this point, I'd reached the gates of Thunderdome, and there was no turning back. Were the mushrooms dilated, time to shorten it? Eating an entire bar from the dispensary had the opposite effect. Time stood still. And after dancing and rocking out for what seemed 2 lifetimes, my extremities began to fail me. At first, it was a perceived tightness in my legs that prevented me from jumping and banging like a coke fiend. And so my amplitude decreased to sidelong bounces. And bounces fade into sways. And finally, as though I had no legs at all, I flowed into the ground, no longer able to stand. The cycle was complete. I'd reached Thunderdome, and I was completely beyond it. As the crowds of people began encroaching on our space, my Bayan brother pulled me from the ground to move me to the lawn where it might be safer to rest. When I thought I'd reached the lowest point of my evening, my body melted into the lap of my Bay and I was unable to move without some Herculean effort. Several rounds of festival goers would check on my condition, including event staff. I was questioned if I knew who I was, where I was, and even when I was. My brain responded in kind, but my body was powerless to provide any positive signals regarding my condition. Even checking the time on my watch was a feat of unparalleled strength. My final memories of the evening include my brother indicating that we had to move, since EMS was going to intervene if I didn't, then making our way across the event to catch a shuttle back to our Airbnb. Somewhere along the way, I had the distinct impression that a tornado had touched down, and that crowds of hysterical people were stampeding in all directions. It was only by closing my eyes that I could block out this chaos, the noise, the insanity. But closing my eyes meant facing the Tilda-whirl inside my head with all of its nausea-inducing rage. I ended up vomiting furiously into a trash can and again out the door of our first Uber home. I'm not sure I even remember how we ended up in the first Uber. I thought we were taking the shuttle. Wait, I ordered a second Uber? Now I'm falling askew onto the end of one of our beds in the Airbnb. I see my phone is plugged into the wall. Eyes closed. Brain off. Eyes open. It's 5 a.m. Is that my alarm? Holy shit, did I set that? Is this real life? Shit, I've got to pack. My plane leaves in a few hours. Holy shit.
This episode was produced by me, Philip Johnson. All songs used can be found in the description section of this episode. Special thanks to Gustavo for reading this awesome piece. If you liked what you heard today, please subscribe. Also, rate and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd like to write in and tell me what you think, or if you'd like to check out some Psychotropic related merch, or if you have a story you'd like to share, you can do all this at psychotropicpodcast.com. If you'd like to get an idea about the content of the next episode, you can do this by following Psychotropic Podcast on Instagram at Psychotropic Podcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening, everybody. See you next time.